Hello, hello. Is this on? Good afternoon. Good afternoon. Good afternoon. Yeah, the third time is always a charm. But really warm welcome to all of you, both here and those who are also online. I'm Brahima Coulibaly, the Vice President of the Global Economy and Development Program at Brookings. I know there's no shortage of events or places where you can be in this really busy Anga week, so we're very honored and grateful that you've chosen to spend this part of the afternoon with us to discuss multilateralism and the role of US leadership, particularly in the context of the upcoming presidential elections. For those of us who've been working on multilateralism for a while, I think it was quite clear that there were some fault lines. Even though for the past 80 years or so, it has served the world relatively well. But it's also increasingly clear that it's unable to address some of the challenges that we face now, from inequality to environmental deprivation, degradation, to concentration of deprivations and geopolitical tensions, among others. We're 5 years, I think, away, or maybe less, to the 2030 SDG, and it's pretty clear mid-year through the assessment that we're way off track and nowhere close to meeting those targets. Right. But to many others, I think the COVID-19 was really the eye-opener in terms of some of the imperfections that we have in the multilateral system. And ever since, we've seen really voices rise up to support the reform of the multilateral system, including the UN Secretary General's own Summit of the Future. But for its part, Brookings has also been really active. We've ramped up our work on multilateralism to kind of put forward some ideas on what a revamped reform multilateralism could look like. I have to disclose we approach this work in a very collaborative way. We involve about 40 independent experts from over 30 think tanks across the global north and global south. So we're really proud of that collaborative approach, and some of whom are among our speakers that we have here today. So the recommendations and the reports are all available on the Brookings website. And I was told too that this QR code, you can scan it and then you get access to those reports. Yeah. Yeah. If you see the card somewhere, that's what it's for. Yeah. I'm also very encouraged by the near universal endorsement that we've had with the Pact of the Future, which is a testament, I believe, to the commitment, notwithstanding current challenges of the leaders, to really equip the world with a multilateral system that can address the challenges of the 21st century. But in this roundtable discussion we've had with the colleagues across the world, it was increasingly clear that no matter how good the recommendation, how sound they are, the political will and the commitment of the leaders would be critical if we're going to go from ideas to implementation. And I think this year has been dubbed the voters' year, because based on the Washington Post report, that 80 countries or more who've had national elections either had or will have this year, and that's half of the world's population. But arguably, the conversation has really focused on the outcome of the US elections. As I traveled across Europe, Africa, one of the first questions I always get, what's going to happen November in the US elections? And I'm thinking if I had a crystal ball, we'd be happy to tell you. But I think it's because we see it as potentially being the most consequential election for multilateralism. And among the questions on the minds is really how committed is the US to the current multilateral system and rule-based order, right? And whether the next president is prepared to throw the full weight of the US government behind a reform agenda regardless of who wins. And if not, then what would a multilateral system look like with a diminished leadership coming from its pioneering nation, right? Those are among the questions that were on people's mind. And these are really complex issues and questions, but we are very fortunate to have an exceptional set of speakers. I couldn't think of a better group of experts to help us make sense of this all than the group we've assembled, and we're really grateful they took time out of their busy schedule to share their thoughts and views with us. So in terms of flows, I'm going to do a short fireside session with Professor Stiglitz, and then I'll turn it over to Rana Faruha from the Financial Times and CNN to moderate the great panel, and afterwards then we'll assemble there for a brief reception. But before I conclude, let me take a moment to express my gratitude really to the Ford Foundation, not just for hosting us, but for being really the partner that you have been on this work of around multilateralism, and also thank the Gates Foundation. And I'd like especially to acknowledge Salil Booker, who we worked with very closely. I understand he'll be moving on very soon, but we look forward, Ato, to working with you here and continuing on this agenda. So on behalf of my colleagues at Brookings and I, we really wish you all the best on your next step. So with that, please join me to welcome Nobel laureate, Professor Joseph Stiglitz, to the podium. Yes, please. So Professor Stiglitz, thank you for really taking the time to be with us and share your thoughts. I think the world knows you as the Nobel laureate, but for many in my generation, and even before and after, you're a towering figure in the field, and we've learned a lot of our economics from reading your work. And I was sharing with you in the green room that I just finished taking on my comprehensive exams, and I was going to be turning to my dissertation. So I really thought I understood the importance of markets and how they work, everything I had learned. Then I read his book that came out in 2002 on globalization and its discontent. And that really made me scratch my head to try to contextualize a bit more what I had learned. But as stated earlier, I think there's growing consensus that the system has served us relatively well, but it's also clear that it needs to be revamped. So you more than most, you focus on this issues of the imperfection in the system much earlier than most. So when was it for you the moment when you realized that it needs to be reformed? And what over the years, from what you've observed, had worked well, and where were some of those shortcomings? So we need to know that too, and what was also some of the great things about it, so we're mindful not to reform away what was working.
Well, your question, when did I first become aware, is a really hard question. I think it was when I was in college, and you started seeing things like what went on in Chile and Pinochet, and a little bit late, that was a little after I got out of college, but there were clearly things that were going on that were upsetting, where U.S. intervention in Greece, and so those were, you might say, radicalizing. It wasn't really until though I got into the Clinton administration that I really understood the deficiencies in global governance. And I say that because in many ways, the U.S. government was taking a very strong role in trying to shape it. But when you say the U.S. government, it became very clear it wasn't American citizens. It wasn't what, quote, we cared about. It was what Wall Street cared about. And in the beginning, very early into the Clinton administration, I wrote a paper about what were America's international economic interests. And I explained that, I argued that it wasn't, the objective wasn't making the world safe for Wall Street. And I jokingly refer to an important initiative that had been part of the Bush administration. It's easier to tease the previous administration than your own. They had, as a key aspect of their trade policy, been telling Japan that it ought to open up its doors to Toys R Us. In retail more broadly. And I said, well, it's very nice that Japanese children should get cheaper toys. I'm all in favor of that. And it's very nice for Chinese workers to be able to sell toys to Japanese workers. But why was it important for U.S. economic policy, international economic policy, for an American company that was selling Chinese goods in Japan and making a profit? Why was those profits an important objective of U.S. economic policy? Of course, I didn't get an answer. And we were doing the same thing in Wall Street. And some of the things that went on when I was in the administration ricocheted than when I was in the World Bank. So one of the big fights I had in this agenda of making the world safe for Wall Street was whether we should demand countries to get rid of their capital controls, the capital management processes. And Korea was one of the countries, and they had done a report that said, well, we ought to do it gradually and we ought to do it carefully. And Treasury said, no, Goldman Sachs wants it to be done right away. And we started bashing Korea. And we had a big fight internally in the administration with the Council of Economic Advisors saying, there's no theory or evidence in favor of your position. I later wrote some papers explaining why the theory was wrong. As so often happens, I lost. Treasury won, but the world lost because just a few years later, and really a short time later, they did open up their capital market, and then Korea was a major victim of the East Asia financial crisis. And so, it was one of those things, how quickly things came back to haunt us for bad policy.
And I think now we can all agree that opening up the capital accounts indiscriminately may not have been the wisest thing to do. So again, speaking of being a bit ahead of of your time. So the highlight really of this UNGA is undoubtedly the Summit of the Future with the pact that was near universally endorsed. What is your assessment of that reform agenda as based on what you know about it, and is it does it strike the right notes in terms of what will get us to the promised land?
Well, if you see it as a renewal of a wedding vow that we're going to recommit ourselves to multilateralism, and if you look at it at a very high level, hopefully wedding vows are taken more seriously, but but if you look at it at a very high level, it was a very good thing that the world came together essentially unanimously. Nobody, even the dissenters were forced to be silent in their dissent. And it touched a lot of topics that were very important, including some new topics like the digital space, which I think really needs global regulation. But if you ask two questions, was it concrete in details? Did it have a really concrete way forward, even on the economic areas? And then, more particularly, does it resolve any of the deep governance problems that have prevented the multilateral system of being effective on the even more important issues of peace and security? So let me try to, highlight some examples where, it's very, as I'll begin talking about economics, obviously. The WTO was an important agreement of countries having a rules-based trading system. That's what we say, and it was supposed to be fair rules. But we know that underlying the WTO was a particular economic ideology, which was neoliberalism. And we know that ideology, the fact I used the word ideology makes it clear that it wasn't an economic theory, has now been shown to be wanting. And so you have a global economic architecture for trade where most people, I think, who look at it dispassionately understand that it doesn't make any economic sense. And in some ways, I would say it's even worse because if you look at the architecture, it has a couple of critical aspects of it that have maintained the disadvantageous positions of developing countries and emerging markets. So when you began your remarks in saying the multilateral system did well, I was thinking, well, it did well for those who were well off. You might say it didn't do so well for a lot of other people. And just to give you, some consequences of that, manifestations of that, are that neocolonial trade patterns still exist. That the developing countries are still exporting primary products. And you see that the rules are designed to maintain that neocolonial pattern. When Indonesia tries to say, we want our nickel to be processed in Indonesia, Europe files a WTO complaint against them. And I could go on and give examples after example. But I think nowhere did the deficiencies in the multilateral system exhibit themselves more strongly than during the pandemic, where we had vaccine apartheid. We were throwing away vaccines rather than giving them access to developing countries. We restricted intellectual property rights. We put profits over lives. And this has had enormous consequences, both for multilateralism, but also for the view that the US and Europe can be trusted. That they are thinking about the interests of the global system. It is, you might say, to go back to my first remark, state capture. If you ask most Americans whether they think people in Africa should die so that Pfizer makes, which is just down the street here, should make a little bit more money, I bet if we had a referendum on that, 90% of people would say lives are more important than Pfizer's profits, especially when we, the taxpayers, funded the research that Pfizer's making the profits off of. So, there's obviously a problem in the multilateral system, but that problem in the multilateral system is in turn related to governance problems within our member states. So you know, when we have complaints about multilateralism, we can't separate that from complaints that we ought to be having about governance here at home. You know, it's not just the multilateral system. Let me give you just a couple of other examples of where things haven't gone well. One of the things that became very clear, again in the pandemic and the Russian invasion of Ukraine, was that neoliberalism, free trade, had made our economies have a lack of resilience. We couldn't even produce face masks, protective gear, let alone complicated products. And when Russia invaded Ukraine and we put sanctions, the price of oil went up, and it had enormous effects on the global economy. You know, in my book, Making Globalization Work, which was the successor to the book you mentioned, my wife said, you can't just complain, you have to give answers. And so I wrote that book. But one of the things, a little bit of a complaint, was it was stupid for Germany to be so dependent on Russian gas. It was so obvious. You know, Bush may have said, I looked into Putin's eye and I saw somebody I could trust. But, you know, I looked into what was going on and I said, this is risky, very risky. And it turned out, I don't want to say I was right, but a lot of people were right in saying that. So that was where our WTO framework led us. And if we had tried to stop that, we would have been hauled before the WTO. Just a couple of other things, just examples. On the financial side, the global system led to the global financial crisis of 2008. The idea that U.S. Treasury pushed that capital should move freely across borders meant that a mistake in financial regulation in the United States and a crisis here spread globally. Yep. So we created a fragile, multilateral, global financial system. And now we have a debt problem. And we have not done anything to resolve it. I was on a UN commission after chaired a UN commission after the global financial crisis, and we told what to do about that. And the UN actually endorsed these ideas, but like a lot of, you know, you came back, you were talking about the UN Pact, it went through the General Assembly, even principles of debt restructuring were adopted by the UN. But 5-6 countries voted against. And they happen to be the US, UK, Japan, the countries where all the debt contracts are written. So one more point about the multilateral system that I think the Pact doesn't really effectively address is, you know, we thought we had a rules-based system for trade. I use that just as an illustration, but I think it's very good. We thought and everybody had to play by the rules. Well, when it looked to the U.S. that those rules were not convenient for it, what did the U.S. do? Well, first it said, we don't like the judges because they're ruling in ways that we don't like. So we won't appoint any more judges until there's a reform of the rules. And the reform has to be, I mean, my joke is to make sure that we always win. They don't say it quite like that, but that's the content of it. They say no overreach. And the U.S. industrial policy has thumbed its nose at the rules. And that has led a lot of countries to say, if you have a rules-based system, where the powerful say we only obey the rules when they're convenient for us, and we agree with them. Is that a rules-based system, or is it really a charade? And is a charade worse than nothing? I think a charade is probably better than nothing, but that's an interesting question. So what I worry about in this pact is, do we have a path forward for actually doing something? And you see that in the inability to deal with the big issues of Gaza, the Russian invasion of Ukraine or Sudan. And, I would have liked them to have actually talked more forcefully about a thing like reclusing yourself if you are one of the parties, which is in the UN Charter already. But those are too sensitive for them to be willing to address in this kind of a pact. So they've avoided the key issues and the key sticking points.
Right. And I think the UN Secretary General kind of sums it up when he said, "We've now opened the door to the future. Now let's walk through it." And I certainly agree with you that the multilateralism hasn't worked the same way for everyone. But my word "relatively" was perhaps a subtle way of alluding to that. But if we can pivot now really to the U.S. election, and you begin to answer part of that question. So under the Trump administration, clearly there was a bit of a retrenchment from the U.S. leadership. But then under even a Biden administration, there were some policies that have caught many by surprise, like the Inflation Reduction Act, Science and Jobs Act, the Science and Technology, and then the Investment and Infrastructure and Investment and Jobs Act. It wasn't so much the legislation, but some of the protectionist elements that were embedded in them, right? So many are really wondering, to make sense of this, is the U.S. turning its back against multilateralism? Is that what this is? And how would that play out depending on the scenario we get in post-November?
Well, I think U.S. does recognize.
No, this is hard to predict, but
I
would trust your crystal ball than mine. So.
Well, first, I think obviously the election makes a very big difference because one of the candidates is really committed to a kind of going back to isolationism, sort of the worst tendencies that have been in America's past, not sensitive to the need for global cooperation, really threatening and badgering, and I traveled all over the world like you did, and the fear of what will happen if Trump gets elected is great. I was at a conference where I can't say who it was because of the chatham room rules, but a very, very prominent Republican said that actually Trump will be more successful in foreign policy because he's so chaotic that no one will know what he will do. And in those of you who are economists know in game theory that there is a certain advantage of being crazy. And there are really models that formalize the idea of how the advantages of being irrational, that it's rational to be irrational. But he's not doing the rationality rationally, he is irrationally irrational. And for somebody who has a finger on the nuclear bomb, that's not comfortable. And I was just, quite shocked that this was, that they recognize this guy's crazy, but they think that's an advantage. And I think it's risky, and particularly in this current environment. So it makes a great deal of difference. Now, the problem is, I think the Harris, I think the Democrats do recognize the need for global cooperation. I think part of their stance is being forced by the politics of the right. And so they're forced to take more, less multilateral position in order to appeal to some of the voters that they think Trump may be appealing to. So that's a bad part of it. But I think quite apart from that, there is what I think is a little bit of an irrational worry about competition from China, and that has taken a very difficult, nasty turn and divided the world. I'm sure in our panel we'll talk about that into a very polarized. People describe it as a new Cold War. There have been a lot of discussions as what are the similarities and differences between the new Cold War and the old Cold War. But it is clearly the world is being very polarized. China has said, China has done some things that clearly we aren't happy about, like giving some support to Russia in the war in Ukraine, and I think justifiably we should be angry about that. It has threatened to take over Taiwan, which is, something we should be understandably concerned about. But it hasn't yet done that. But the result of this polarization is dramatic in terms of the question of whether the multilateral system will work going forward. One thing I'll just mention, I was at a really interesting seminar yesterday of the Munich Security Council, and they did a report, a survey called "Views on Western Double Standards and the Value of International Rules." So they did and they focused on questions like, is the West viewed to have double standards? And within the West, where is U.S., not only the West, compare China, Russia, U.S., and Europe in their degree of double standards. And U.S. always does things better than other countries, and we do more. We are viewed as having being worse on double standards by most countries, not everywhere. Yeah. We have friends around the world, but it is very disturbing that if you think that part of winning this new Cold War is winning the hearts and minds of those in the rest of the world, we need to do a lot better job than we're doing. And I think part of that is a really renewed commitment to multilateralism that won't happen under Trump. I think it may happen under Harris.
I think I've been getting signals here that we're over time. Can we take a couple of questions? Okay. All right. With that, thank you. Yes, thank you, Professor Stiglitz. It's so really great to get your insights on this sort of complex set of issues. I think we could have gone on for another hour and not even scratch the surface of all the issues we wanted to get into. But it sets up well the panel that Urana is going to moderate. And thank you again for those insights.
welcome my panel up. And no, you guys come on up and grab a seat, and I'll just introduce you as you sit down. First of all, I have to say, you all, and particularly Joe Stiglitz, tough act to follow. Great fireside. I was taking notes the whole time for future columns. And really an honor to be here moderating this panel on the presidential election and the future of multilateralism. I will just quickly go down the line here. To the far right, we have Jose Antonio Ocampo, who's a professor and director of the School of International and Public Affairs at Columbia. To his left, we have Anne Marie Slaughter, who is the Chief Executive Officer of the New America Foundation. To her left, Vera Songwe, who is a non-resident senior fellow on the Global Economy and Development Program at Brookings. And just to my right, we have Mark Malik Brown, who is the former Deputy Secretary General of the UN. So thank you all for being here with me. We've got about 50 minutes or so we're going to chat for about 35, and then I'm going to open it up for questions. So be thinking about your questions, and then we'll have a reception afterwards. You know, one of the things I took from Joe's conversation is we're here to talk about the U.S. presidential elections and the future of multilateralism, but multilateralism goes way beyond the U.S. potentially, and so I definitely want to get there. But just in the interest of you know, the news value of November, let's start with that. And Anne Marie, I think I'm going to start with you and ask you to just set the stage. I mean, certainly in this country, we feel that it's an existential moment. I know a lot of my colleagues who work abroad feel that way too. There does seem to be a kind of suspense. Everyone's waiting. A lot of policy action around the world is waiting. So maybe you can kind of sketch out the stakes and then give me your sort of hot take on what you think the future of multilateralism is. Harris v. Trump, and then we'll jump in.
As long as you're not asking me my hot take on the outcome of the election.
Won't do that. It's too close to call for anybody.
So let me just start by thanking Brookings and thanking Ford for putting this together, and also acknowledging one of my board members who's there in the front row. I'm going to have to be on my very best behavior, Bob Abernethy, who is also a Brookings board member. So I'll start with multilateralism in the election. I will start by saying I'm confident that 99.9% of Americans have never heard of the Pact for the Future. Some may be aware that the UN General Assembly happens. Certainly, everybody in New York is. But by and large, it's a sort of standard line that foreign policy rarely plays a really big role in elections. In this case, in the Harris campaign, it's playing almost no role. Even, you know, last time around, Trump kept saying he would pull out of NATO. Even that, he's not saying that. He's saying he got NATO to pay up. But, you know, frankly, Obama pushed NATO to pay up, and so has Biden. So for if you look at the Harris campaign materials, you will not see anything about the United Nations or multilateralism. That's not true on the Republican side. And I will say I was a little surprised. I'm going to quote you. Now, this is Project 2025. And of course, Trump has said he's not going to implement Project 2025. On the other hand, J.D. Vance was a big intellectual contributor. Certainly, he worked with the folks who put it. And so multilateralism is a rallying cry, a negative one, because multilateralism is the kind of code or the slogan for global elitism. So just as the campaign is against domestic elites, multilateralism, and I'll read to you, there's in Project 2025, it says, like the progressive Woodrow Wilson a century ago. I was very surprised to see Trump or Project 25 citing Wilson. The woke left today seeks a world bound by global treaties they write, in which they exercise dictatorial powers over all nations without being subject to democratic accountability. Now, we just heard a panel about how the Pact for the Future doesn't have enough teeth and the Security Council has been completely paralyzed. No, on the right, the argument is that we, the people who sit in rooms like this, write global treaties, and the American people are not consulted. So I think that's interesting, that is part of a sort of broader anti-elite populist account. So I will give you my best guess as to what happens if they're elected. So if Harris is elected, I think she'll be very tough in many ways. She'll have to be. The first woman president has no choice. She will go eyeball to eyeball with Russia, with China. She is not going to give. I always cite, Madeleine Albright, the first woman Secretary of State, who sort of said to Colin Powell, "What good is this great army of yours if you don't use it?" But at the same time, Harris is, I think, by background, by temperament, by gender, by all sorts of things, very alive to a lot of the big global issues that the Pact for the Future addresses. And so I suspect that publicly she'll be very tough, but she will appoint an important, really somebody who is close to her as UN ambassador. I expect her to be closer to Obama, who was really determined to go through the UN and through other international institutions, probably than Biden was. If it's Trump, he's not going to play ball with the UN. He's going to ignore it. He's going to ignore other global institutions. Again, I don't think he'll talk about pulling out of NATO. I do think he will make common cause. And here's the thing I worry the most about. He'll make common cause with a lot of the populists in Europe, and the EU has been the great champion of multilateralism. But increasingly, the right in Europe is already weaponizing environmentalism. And I think you could see a real push against the EU as standing as the pillar for the rules-based order. And that would be a very bad thing.
That is a really acute and concise laying out of some of the stakes, a lot in there, and I feel like we could parse all of that for a long time, but I want to give everybody a question and just get you in the conversation. Jose, let me bring you in, because I know you have a lot to say about the U.S. effect on some of the multilateral institutions, from the UN to the WTO to the Security Council. Talk a little bit, and I'm wondering if you want to also play off of some of what Joe said about, some of the flaws in the U.S. led rules-based system. Where have the problems been in your mind, and where would things go, Harris v. Trump, if depending on the election? That's a lot, but give me a couple minutes. You can do it.
Okay. Let me say. Start by the following statement. The United States was the creator of multilateralism after the Second World War. I mean, that's quite clear. The major meetings, Bretton Woods and the UN, were created in the United States. They are headquartered in the United States. So, I mean, that was it. But the ambivalence through time is also quite clear in the case of the US. For example, let me say, many UN conventions have not been ratified by the United States. You can say the US has withdrawn from certain UN organizations at different times. Let's say the last one, the Paris Agreement, the Trump administration withdrew from that. So that ambivalence has become very clear, let's say. Now, so let me take, for example, certain issues. I mean, big question marks. Climate change, following up on the issue. It's quite clear that let's say the Biden administration has, come back to the principles of the international climate change, fight against climate change. But the Trump administration was actually the one that withdrew the U.S. from the Paris Agreement and has announced that all these Biden policies are going to be, now. So that ambivalence. But let me take other topics. For example, the international tax negotiations. That the U.S. has voted against all of them. Actually, for example, the terms of reference for the UN Convention that was approved in August, there are only 8 votes against, including the US and the UK. For example, the European Union, which had voted against the original General Assembly resolution, now abstain. So I mean, that's an improvement, let's say. But the US doesn't seem to be in line. And actually, the implementation of the OECD agreements of 2021 in this country has been 0. Nothing. Okay. Let me say the trade issue that you mentioned. I mean, it's quite clear that the unilateral protectionism has become, and that I would say was in a sense pushed by Trump, but has been followed by Biden. And maybe it will continue. The U.S. Was the one that did not allow the naming of the members of the dispute settlement mechanism in WTO, which for me is the best dispute settlement mechanism in the international system. So it's not working now because of the United States. I mean, then again, both are on the same line. And just talking about the Cold War that you mentioned, let me say something. This Cold War in trade is very different from the old Cold War. In the old Cold War, for example, the countries were aligned politically according to different in trade as well as in let's say in politics, let's say. But now, actually, very funny question. The deputy of the IMF was giving a lecture in the International Economic Association in December, saying that the Cold War was back. And I said, all of Latin Americans in the meeting said, please don't get us involved in the Cold War because China is too important a trade partner for us. Well, so the Cold War now in trade is going to be different.
So you have just hit so many important points, and actually, I just want to share, everything you've said. One might think about the U.S. as just a bit period. Forget about Harris v. Trump. The U.S. as being a risk factor to global multinationalism. Vera, I want to come to you because I know you have thoughts on what happens regardless of who's in office and how the world as a whole might proceed with multilateralism ex the U.S. Because this is something, I mean, a lot of business people I know are starting to think about the U.S. kind of like an emerging market or an old line emerging market. I mean, honestly, diversifying risk away, and I'm wondering, kind of bring that into the political sphere. How do you think about it all?
Thank you. Let me start also by thanking Brookings. Oh, sorry. Can you hear me? Yes. So let me start by thanking Cole and Brookings for being here. The Ford Foundation, of course, for hosting us and supporting the Brookings, and honored to be on the panel with everybody. I think so. We're talking here about the U.S. and its multilateralism, and I think what we have seen, at least from the African perspective in particular, but some of what I would say is, I think, aligned with Latin America, because we have a similar relationship with what I would call the middle powers. And so I think something that is happening now is sort of, before we had sort of those who vote together, the US, the UK, and Japan, and in the EU, and then you had the rest of the world. And now you have still sort of quote unquote the G7, but we have middle powers now. And so there's a whole different kind of multilateralism, because and the first demonstration of sort of the emergence of middle powers was the BRICS. And in some sense now, of course, the BRICS are sort of disintegrating within themselves, because Russia is on one side and China is on one side, but there still are. We have Indonesia coming up. We have Brazil trying to claim its space at the table. We have Egypt trying to talk. So there's a series of middle powers that are coming up, and I think that there's Mexico, and actually that is an important conversation, because a lot of the trade conversation is happening through China, through Vietnam, into Mexico, and back into the United States. And so when we say we're going to put tariffs, are we going to put tariffs on Mexico, or are we going to put tariffs on China? And one has to understand it. And I think that's what is happening now in the developing world is we're saying, please don't have a Cold War with us because we just saw 53 of our heads of states from Africa all go to China. And this is the first time after sort of the huge tensions between China and the United States. I think early on, if you remember when a lot of the Africans voted, quote unquote, on the surprising side of the Russia war, and there was a lot of tension in America because, and almost punishment, countries got cold saying, you voted on the wrong side and we're going to punish you for this and we're not going to give you support. I think in the EU, a number of countries that did not get support, to send support to Africa or rediverted because of the way African countries had voted at the beginning of the Russia-Ukraine conflict. And when the China conflict was going up, there was a sense that the US will use the multilateral system again to punish countries. And so there was a conversation about, will the next FOCAC have the same number of African presidents? They all went. They all went. And so I think it's a very strong statement about whether, is it the US that is pulling out of multilateralism? But I want to come back also to even the question of multilateralism as we see it today and the rules-based system. And is something Professor Stiglitz mentioned, is whose rules? And my sense is that the whole system almost is collapsing because the rules are no longer our rules. It's their rules. And exactly as you said, when their rules don't work for them, then they change it. And in the process of changing it, the WTO gets stuck. In the process of changing it, the ICC, gets compromised. In the process of changing it, trade and export bans happen, or you can do coal in one jurisdiction and not in another jurisdiction. And so essentially, the multilateral system that we so want to protect, is almost not good for us anymore.
That's really interesting. All right, I have several follow-up questions, but I want to give Mark a chance at the mic too. Mark, I saved you for last in part because when we were sort of prepping for this panel, you were a little bit optimistic in your first talking point in that you said, multilateralism's great, but we don't need it for everything. And I was thinking of you because I read in the paper today about the agreement signed by, I think it was 12 or 14 countries for minerals procurement. I mean, that's an interesting example of you can do things in bite-sized pieces. So expand on that.
Well, look, I mean, I think there's always this sort of starting slightly lazy assumption that the world needs to kind of be broadly at peace with itself in order for multilateralism to work. And yet, through most of the post-World War II history, the world has been anything but at peace with itself. We had a sort of glorious post-1989 golden age till the early 2000s when, it was reflected in huge multilateral gains, the introduction of the Millennium Development Goals, doctrines such as the responsibility to protect, the creation of the International Criminal Court. So there's no doubt when the world is at peace with itself, you can have very creative sort of international innovation and institution building. But most of the time we've had to struggle with levels of conflict and competition, and yet there's still progress. And, sometimes people are quite good at sort of rubbing up, using like the sort of bit of grit in the oyster shell, using that to get things done. I mean, one just example, from this new pact, we first had, not in the pact, but the little country of Liechtenstein, the patient ambassador after 20 years getting through his General Assembly sort of dream resolution, which said whenever the Security Council uses its veto, there must be a General Assembly vote. For years wouldn't go anywhere, but then the Americans wanted to kind of give the Russians a black eye over Ukraine. Now it's being used to give the Americans a black eye over the Middle East. But now and Mintu or an expert, correct me if I'm wrong about this, but in the Pact for the Future is another little sort of piece of ordnance in the long grass, which is that states must respect Article 27.3 of the Charter, which actually says that permanent members of the Security Council must not vote in areas in which they are compromised, e.g. Russia as the invader of thing. Now, we're going to sit back and watch years of whether the US is compromised over the Middle East. But, you know, again, so my only point is, in conflict, things move forward. But very quickly to your point, but when that doesn't happen, this sort of minilateralism is the other way forward. And, you know, what I have watched time after time is circumstances where particularly like-minded states, the Norways, Canadas are classic sort of examples of this island as well, who together with an NGO civil society coalition, you know, build enough momentum for something to get it done. I mean, going way back, landmine treaty and other things, but then are able to use the platform of the UN to subsequently universalize it. So my only point is to sort of argue against the thing. A very last point, though, but which, if I may, which is the only problem with my theory, to be my own devil's advocate for a moment, is that on almost every issue in multilateralism at the moment, I'm very involved with plans for restructuring or repositioning the World Bank and the IMF. But whether it's that kind of economic governance issue, Security Council here, progress on nearly every issue in a time where other parts of the world feel underrepresented and underheard and feel they're being governed by doctrines which are 80 years old and very Western. Every issue requires US concessions. It requires US statesmanship to say, we've got too much power in this institution, we're suffocating its growth. The Security Council would be more powerful if others were in here permanently as well. The World Bank and IMF would be much more effective if others had a bigger voice and we had a somewhat smaller one. Now, the problem is Trump or a first woman president, will either of them, in Trump's case, have any interest in making the concessions? In President Harris's case, will she have the political capacity to make that kind of statesman-like concession that power comes from a bigger cake in which we have a smaller slice?
Interesting. Anne-Marie, you had a point you wanted to jump in on there.
Just that I agree the U.S. has to make concessions, but on Security Council and the IMF and World Bank, Europe has to make concessions, right? I mean, Europe is wildly overrepresented. The EU is not represented, and France and Britain are. So I do think it's possible that Harris could make that kind of concession with Europe, not alone. But there is a real appetite on both sides of the political aisle in the U.S. for burden sharing. So if the idea is we are no longer the global policeman, we are actually making these institutions work, so we have to carry less of the burden, maybe.
You want to jump in?
I mean, the risk, or at least the fright has always been that if the US gives up its interest in the World Bank, then they will stop funding it. This has been the quiet threat, right? And so essentially, it's always that's where we are. It's we can push that, but if we push it, then we must then have, quote unquote, the middle powers step up and pay out. And are they capable of doing it? It's not clear to me. But this has been the tension.
I want to bring forward, before we get about another 5 or 10 minutes, and then we'll open it up for questions. Tax, trade, and climate are three areas that we've all touched on where there's a need for new institutional dynamism, more multilateralism, and there's some interesting ideas out there. So let me start with trade. Under Biden, Catherine Tai, the USTR, did float some ideas, not too much meat on the bones yet, but certainly some new ideas about how you move on to a new paradigm. She's called it a post-colonial trade paradigm, which I find very interesting. She also got into thinking about how could the global South and the North work together. One of the ideas I actually discussed with her at some length is, all right, you're in a situation now where the global South has a lot of the resources that are necessary, for example, for the clean energy transition, rare earth minerals, et cetera, but they need tech transfer. How do you create a new sharing of the wealth pie, which is kind of the core problem that Joe touched on? Vera, do you want to maybe start with that? And then Jose, I want to hear your thoughts too. Do you like the idea of this post-colonial trade paradigm? Do you Do you have another idea for how trade should be rethought for a new era?
The simple idea would be to get Africa into the IRA. And so we could benefit directly from all of that trade. And I think the fact that that is not, so rather than continue the AGOA, which is almost a colonial trade pact because it's only oil, if the IRA is clearly rare minerals, clearly climate, clearly sort of the new economy, and if we said all countries that are under AGOA just migrate into the IRA and have the benefits of that investment, as they're doing with Mexico, by the way, I think that would be a huge jump in almost sort of leveling the playing field. The danger today is that the protectionism around rare earth minerals, around scrap metal, is actually going to widen the trade gaps between the developed and the developing countries.
Oh, that's a great. Jose, do you want to jump in on this?
Well, my point is that the U.S. has to commit to WTO rules, and that's the basic problem, because I mean the two last administrations, probably many more in the past, have not fully committed to WTO rules. Respecting. I mean, now China does not either. But anyway, that's a big mess of the world today. I mean, let me say actually, very peculiarly in the case of WTO, there is one peculiar issue, which is intellectual property rights. Now, intellectual property rights were included in WTO, right, in the UN system, because of the insistence of the US that it should be on the WTO. Now, that's total dominance of the US, let's say, because the freedom to use intellectual property right. I mean, we saw during COVID, there were some, during the HIV, there were some exceptions, but even COVID did not allow any exception to intellectual property rights. And that's a big mess. I mean, when we think of the North-South, let's say, or the developing country, in this broader trading system, including intellectual property rights.
Mark, do you want to jump in on this? And do you have thoughts about whether the U.S. should, I personally don't think this is politically possible, but just sort of suck it up and recommit to the WTO? Or is there something out there that's different in your bite-sized world that could be done?
Well, look, I'm one of those who sort of, because I think I detect a difference of opinion between Columbia's two fine professors here. And I sort of slightly find myself on Joe's side in the sense that, I think that the IRA reflects a very significant shift in the prevailing economic ideology of the United States. I think we are moving into an era, and I'm not commenting on the right or wrong of it, it's an observation, where we are moving back to state-led industrial policy, but with the word green tucked in somewhere there. And, this has got profound implications for all three of the international institutions created at Bretton Woods, WTO, IMF, and World Bank, when your sort of prevailing dominant intellectual owner of, in addition to being your other, physical shareholder, is moving. And I think it is very dangerous, because while I do believe it's probably the way all our countries are going to move, you look at something like critical minerals and you really worry about politics and states getting too deeply into this sector for everybody's good. Because, if indeed supply lines are going to be political and security driven from the start, the potential for conflict down the road has got to be huge. The potential for a region like Africa to face new kind of scramble-like possibilities as different blocks and countries seek to secure lithium and other precious metal supplies means, if we are going to a more state-directed economy, we are going to more resilient supply chains, the sooner we can get a revised rule of law in place to govern it, the safer we're going to be.
Okay, Anne-Marie, jump in and then.
So just on this question of a new industrial policy, that's certainly where we're heading with the IRA and foreign policy for the middle class and Europe then responding. I think, though, it really depends on whether inflation or unemployment is more important, because through much of the 1990s and the aughts, we were losing jobs, although we know that it's more from technology than offshoring, but offshoring was certainly a piece of it. But everything got dramatically cheaper. Right? Goods, suddenly you could afford all sorts of things. And now, where voters are saying, the cost of living in this city, I pay $15 for a non-alcoholic cocktail, right? I think there's like maybe 90 cents of ginger ale in there but so, I really do think it depends. You're seeing that swing. You've got an awful lot of corporations in this country who want to go back to freer trade. Nobody's going back to 1990s style or early aughts style. But I don't think we've seen the end of this.
Jose, I'm going to bring you in a minute, but let me actually pull on that string a little bit, because I think you're hitting something interesting. The neoliberal era was sort of dependent in some ways on cheap capital, cheap labor, cheap energy. All that is in flux and changing. The inflationary issue is interesting, though, because in some ways this becomes the tragedy of the commons problem. If you actually built capacity in certain areas, yes, it's inflationary in the short term, but maybe you're getting to a better and more resilient place. But how do you get there? And the inflation issue also touches the private-public power problem that Joe laid out, because companies, as you point out, just want to go back to 1993 and, efficiency models. Anyway, I just want to put that in the room. Jose, jump in.
I'm going to make this statement. If industrial policies are going to be allowed in the world, they have to have rules. And those rules have to be approved by WTO, in my view. That has to be like that. And let me say that under the current system, we run the risk of a situation such as the one that when the WTO was created. I was actually Minister of Agriculture of my country, and I had negotiated the WTO agreement on agriculture. We were totally defeated. In one particular point, we were not allowed, we basically, the developed countries, the US and the European Union, and Japan, of course, fully endorse subsidies for agriculture. But they, at the same time, eliminated the subsidies that developing countries use more, which was on exports. So this is a very funny system, and actually, the way it's going on is a totally unequalizing factor, because the countries that are going to have money to subsidize industrial sectors, whatever they are going to win the fight, and the countries that don't have the resources, the sub-Saharan African countries, many developing countries, are going to be defeated in that process.
Vera, last point, and then we'll open it up for questions.
So it was not a joke when I said that Africa should have access to the IRA, precisely because of the 2 points you've made. The first one is, if Africa benefits from the IRA, then immediately what do we have? We have US industry investing in Africa, producing in Africa with cheap labor, cheap prices, so you don't have the inflation pressure, but you still have the cheap goods, essentially. And so indirectly, you re-level the playing field. Whereas today, what we have is a vast widening of that playing field, because what is happening is, if you were an investor who was going to invest in Africa, with the IRA, it doesn't matter how much de-risking and first loss the World Bank brings into the table, you're going to Nebraska.
Yeah.
So this is very clear. And so the fastest equalizing tool is to open up the IRA to the rest of the continent.
It's a great point. Okay, I have lots more questions, but I want to give you all a chance. We've got, I think, a couple of mic runners. So first question over here.
Hi, good afternoon. Very interesting discussion. My name is Xavier. I work with the Open Society Foundation. So just coming to the point of the IRA and generally climate regulations being used by the West as protectionist measures. So Vera, do you think, to your point, do you think US companies stand a chance against Chinese companies for setting up in Africa, even if they became part of the IRA? If anything, I think China will still be more competitive as places for manufacturing, even for US companies, as it's happening now, and value addition and technology and labor costs?
Very quickly, I personally think that the US is making a mistake. First of all, the one place where multilateralism has worked really well is during the Obama years with China, and I think actually even with Biden, and China and the United States bringing together the world and trying to continue pushing on the climate conversation, with China actually leading that conversation. Let's give it credit for that. On the climate question, I don't think that the US should be competing with China on solar panels. They've lost that battle. The US should continue to compete with China on chips because they'll win that battle. And I think right now, okay, Professor Stiglitz is saying no to that one. But right now they're trying to compete on solar panels, and I don't think it's going to work. And so I think they're expending too much goodwill and too many resources on something. And it's killing us because essentially solar panels for the developing world in particular are probably the cheapest, fastest way of getting generalized electricity and fighting the climate battle. Today we can't do it because of this geopolitics. We can't all get access to Chinese solar panels because you don't get the right funding for it. And I think that's a mistake.
Interesting. Go ahead, Anne-Marie.
So if you really wanted to get bold, I would advise a Harris administration to open negotiations for an Atlantic free trade area, not a North Atlantic free trade area, but an Atlantic free trade area. And if you look at the demography of the United States, as we are heading toward a country where 30% of the United States by 2040 will be from Central or Latin America. And of course, many of those folks have lots of European ties. And the new African-American diaspora of all sorts of all over Africa, but West Africa in particular, it wouldn't be like China in the sense of everything would move out, but it could be a really powerful move to say, you know, we're recognizing where we're going as a country, and instead of Asia's going to rule everything, let's look at the whole Atlantic.
Interesting. Okay, let's take a couple more questions. Don't be shy. Question over here.
Thank you all so very much, and also Professor Stiglitz on the front. I'm gonna toss you all a softball question. There are a few words that I think none of you have yet mentioned, and I'd love to ask any of you to contribute thoughts about human rights and about the role of U.S. Congress and U.S. voters in a moment in which there is, on a national level, generally concern about multilateralism writ large. And there's a voting populace, I mean, you know, we're all following the news, where there is such anger, such animosity, and such a split Congress right now, numerically. I feel like we can't have the loftier conversations about trade policy and economics without also getting to the granular piece of the mess of U.S. Congress. And let me leave it at that. Let me toss this to you as
These
a
are
softball.
great points. I was thinking, how can we construct the question here? But Mark, I'm just going to ask you to weigh in on any of those topics.
Look, I mean, on the Congress, you know, it's a huge problem, but it's not a new problem. I mean, going back to the League of Nations, remember, Woodrow Wilson got shafted when he came home. And then, you know, when it comes to, you know, the Bretton Woods institutions and the UN, there was a real fear that the Congress would do another, you know, do it again. Yeah. And so, you know, it needed astute political management by US leadership in the 40s to get the US and, well, the US Congress, you know, into these institutions and staying there. But you're right. I mean, for my lifetime in and out of the international system, one of the great frustrations is American diplomats telling us you can't commit to something because the Congress, you know, and you know, one of the many anomalies not known is most countries will give you multi-year commitments for things. The US will never give you more than a year at a time, kind of thing, when it comes to funding. So it's in that way, it's not a new problem, but I don't want to take away from the fact that I now see, for all my case for incrementalism of earlier, I see a climate crisis which doesn't allow us time for incrementalism, and a Congress which has got its head so deep in the sand, you don't know where to begin. So, I do think you have an absolutely valid point, but final point, I served as Deputy Secretary General when John Bolton was the American ambassador here, so I've seen and done it all.
That's a very good point.
And to defend the top floors of the building.
Jose, you wanted to have a quick...
No, I'm going to say the U.S. Congress has been a problem in multilateralism in many other cases. I mean, the League of Nations is one case, but ITO, the International Trade Organization that was approved in the Havana Treaty in 1948, which was supposed to be the trade organization of the UN system, actually, was not approved by U.S. Congress. There are many conventions of the UN, including ILO conventions that have not been approved by U.S. Congress. I mean, we can continue. I mean, it's a historical issue in a sense, like I tell my students that the mother or the father of multilateralism doesn't always follow multilateral rules.
Sounds like my family. I'm going to ask one more question, and then I've got a question for the audience. So if anybody has a final burning question, now is your time to ask it. Otherwise, I'll take over. Actually, okay, last question over here from the audience.
Hi, Mintu Pham. I just wanted to ask the panelists, in an ideal world where we were able to make the case to, you mentioned foreign policy for the middle class, make the case for international engagement and multilateralism, or even just to care about what happens in other countries, aside from a terrorist threat or the climate threat, what can we say or do to get Americans to see that this is or politicians to see that this is a winning political issue?
That's a great question. I have thoughts, but Anne Marie, why don't you start?
Yeah. So, traditionally we've made the values argument, right? The shining city on the hill, American exceptionalism. I would make a very different argument today. I would make a self-interested argument. I would say we have moved from rugged individualism to rugged interdependence. And that, whether it is pandemics, and there are, we will have another pandemic within the decade, most likely. And, the idea that better healthcare abroad is directly in our interests. Certainly with climate, I know how hard that is, but actually a majority of the American people fully recognize that climate is a problem. That's the problems of our electoral system, which we need to tackle separately. But the same thing with cyber. I was talking to somebody from Phoenix who was talking about the fact that the Phoenix utility system there are just a few points. So it's 120 degrees in Phoenix in the summer. If there's a cyber attack that takes those out, you will die in a car trying to get out of Phoenix on the one highway that goes north. So those are things that I think you can really bring home to people in a way that honestly, war with China, you cannot, because I do not think Americans are sitting there worrying about nuclear missiles coming from China. And I would say we have to play this role, but we have to play this role with our allies and partners all around the world. Otherwise, we can't solve it.
I want to just amplify what you just said, because in fact, I did a column on this recently, and this point about risk, making this about risk is something that actually goes across the aisle, and even that language does better when you talk about business risk versus ESG, or, so words matter. So we've almost getting the hook here, and we don't want to keep anybody from a drink, but I particularly, yeah, exactly. But I want to just kind of give you all a flash round final word, just to say a few things about any ideas we didn't touch on, maybe a point of optimism to follow Mark, or just a kind of a black swan that you want people to be thinking about. Jose, we'll start with you.
This is not for optimism, but let me say that I put that as an issue I wanted to raise here. U.S. policies toward Latin America. Absent for 20 years. I mean, the last initiative was the Clinton, the Summit of the Americas, and after that, Latin America is essentially ignored by U.S. foreign policy. I mean, the specific issues, maybe Cuba, Venezuela, at different points of time, but Latin America is not in the, I mean, my God, we are part of this continent. And the U.S. should have it. And that's one very peculiar issue. Since Clinton, there has been nothing about Latin America.
I'll second that, but say again, the new America is going to be almost 30% Latin American. It's going to change. It'll take a while. The thing I want to end on is actually something Vera said. I find being at the UN, being at UNGA right this year, I am more conscious of a multipolar world of middle powers than ever before. And I think you are seeing a lot of countries not just playing off US and China the way they played off US versus Russia, but saying, as the Indians have said, our interests are Indian interests and we're going to pursue them as we see fit. That's, I think, a world in which it's hard to get cooperation, but better than a bipolar world.
Very interesting. Vera.
I think there is something particularly positive about what's happening in America today, is that the tension with institutions within the United States is demonstrating, at least to some of us, for 50, 60, 70 years, there was a sense that this was so easy. Look at us in America, we have it all right. Everything is wonderful. And then all of a sudden, there's January 7th, and then there is rigging of elections, and I need 11,000 votes, and you sound like DRC. And so I think that that tension now that you're facing, some humility in identifying with it and saying, we are now like all of you. This is difficult. Democracy is not easy, and democracy and growth and listening to your populations is not as easy as we all thought. Let's sit down and do it. You have the benefit of having the power to write a big check. So you're fighting all these things and you write an IRA check and a GIF check and a DIS check. And so the economy is still growing, it's still the sort of fastest growing. But I think the humility of saying this multilateralism thing where we set up the rules and now we realize even those rules we set up are not working, rather than us just go off and write a new one for ourselves, maybe we can bring everybody together and say, let's relook at how we redo democracy. Let's look at how we redo trade. Let's look at how we redo this. I think there is an opportunity here. And in some sense, the US elections today where to some extent, there is some cross-party conversations happening and Cheney is endorsing Harris and all that. Maybe there is space for a new conversation on what is the new multilateralism that the US wants to put on the table.
I love that point. I absolutely love that point. Mark, final word to you.
Just to build on it in a way, I mean, the sort of Atlanticist view of the UN at the moment and of this summit is, everything's gridlocked, it's impossible to make progress, it's chaotic, it's sclerotic, it's finished. I think if you look through the other end of the telescope, there is this extraordinary sort of, in a strange, not renewal so much of the UN institution itself, but the renewal of power around these two phenomenon of the rise of middle powers, and second, every country, down to the smallest, demanding a degree of agency and sovereignty over their choices of alliances, over their economic trade strategies, that is, a reflection of the long, long shadow of colonialism finally dispersing and of an era of a lot more national sovereignty than we're used to. So, what looks at from a European or American perspective as stasis or chaos, if you're looking from the other side, looks like the UN reorganizing itself as a platform for a much more multi-whatever world of just a lot more sovereign voices who want to be heard and who can't just be neatly corralled into one or other voting lobby like in the past.
That's such a great point to end on. And, the title of this panel was the U.S. presidential elections and the future of multilateralism. But maybe in the future we should flip it, because multilateralism is really having a thriving moment in many ways, regardless of what happens in the U.S. So thank you all for your contributions. Thanks for the great questions. And the bar is open around the corner.